The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. A cache of over 11 million leaked documents, known as the Panama Papers, is continuing to roil political waters in countries around the world. The documents provide insight into a secretive world of shell companies and offshore accounts. The names of several prominent politicians and public officials appear in the records of the transactions that are widely viewed as mechanisms to hide large amounts of cash. Iceland's Prime Minister, Sigmundur Gunnlaugsson, was an early high-profile casualty of the scandal. Other individuals facing this unwelcome attention include close associates of Russian President Vladimir Putin. The Kremlin has characterized the leaks as, quote, a series of fibs aimed at discrediting Putin ahead of elections. To help us sort out the nature and potential impact of this scandal, we're joined once again by Jeffrey Summers, Associate Professor of Political Economy at UW-Milwaukee and Senior Fellow at the Institute of World Affairs. He also serves as visiting faculty at the Stockholm School of Economics in Riga. Well, Jeff, welcome back.
Doug, great to be here again.
We should say at the outset that so far your name has not appeared in any of these papers, so your offshore accounts are safe for the moment.
Indeed.
Well, just talk a little bit about what these papers really are, how they came to be known.
Sure. Well, what they really tell us is about a very expansive and, in fact, global network of offshore banking, which has been used for at least the past 4 decades to engage in a kind of widespread business of tax avoidance and tax evasion, so both legal and illegal forms of avoiding taxes. Now, there is a pedigree here which extends even further back in time, going back to Switzerland and going back even just a little bit before World War I. But it's really in the past 4 decades that we've seen this significant expansion of this kind of activity. And I suspect that we're going to see more and more names released that will indicate just how widespread this use of offshore businesses, shell companies, and accounts indeed is.
Well, there's one particular firm, Mossack Fonseca. There was a Swiss tax expert and a Panamanian partner that formed this firm. But it's significant, isn't it, that these trove of documents, which seems massive, were the result of the activity of one firm. And you suggest there are many, many more of these firms out there.
Indeed. I mean, not only are we just talking about one firm in one country, Panama, which is more integrated into the United States' kind of sphere or a web of offshore finance, but of course we see these offshore enterprises located in countries throughout the world. Now, if we're looking at the United Kingdom, of course, this would include the Channel Islands. It would include locations in the Caribbean. If we're looking at Russia and the CIS, they routinely use Cyprus or Riga in Latvia. The French have their own infrastructure as well, well-known locations such as Monaco. We have other places, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg. In Australia, they use Vanuatu. So, I mean, there is really this very, very, very broad global network of offshore finance that's in existence. It's become very widespread. And when I speak with people in the industry, they just treat it as if it's completely normal. Nobody seems to be concerned about any oversight. I once reported to a European European commissioner that in Riga, Latvia, I encounter people who are involved in this kind of activity all the time. And he kind of feigned a certain interest and raised his eyebrow a bit and kind of pretended to care. He indulged me for a while. But it's not so much that he himself perhaps takes advantage of these kinds of institutions and infrastructure, but I just think that nobody really knows how to tackle it. And in fact, we could even see that with President Barack Obama. In 2008, he actually campaigned on this issue in part. Now, he didn't reference it many times, but he did reference it a few times, saying that there was this very, very, very significant offshore tax avoidance and evasion infrastructure out there that is resulting in, roughly $100 billion a year in the U.S. Treasury being lost because of it. And once elected, it was radio silence. So who knows what happened in terms of his not, deciding to really engage this issue in a serious way.
Well, the Panama Papers trove were the result of a leak from a particular law firm, but there are suggestions that this firm was really just the implementer of services that large banks, huge international banks like HSBC
Sure.
and Credit Banque Suisse, really would like to offer this service to their high-profile and high-capacity depositors. Right?
Absolutely. And again, it's these smaller countries which sometimes just serve as kind of intermediaries to the large banks in New York and in London and in other locations. So sometimes, again, let's just use the example of Riga, Latvia, because of its proximity to the CIS, and there's a certain degree of comfort that people there have with the country because most people are Russian-speaking. They feel comfortable in working in that environment, yet being outside of their own countries, Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, etc., Belarus. But then in, say, Riga, they work directly with the major banks in both Dublin and in London. Now, they used to work with the banks in New York, such as the Bank of New York, up until about 9/11. And then for various reasons, the United States decided that it was a little uncomfortable with some of this activity just because it was providing an infrastructure for terrorist groups to potentially use and to finance their operations. So you had figures like Lucy Edwards, who was a vice president at the Bank of New York, who routinely was bringing the CIS money to New York, which then went into our equity markets. So it really helped to kind of fuel the 1990s stock market boom as well. So this massive transfer of capital from lesser developed countries to the richest countries. So it's really played a very destructive role, not only within rich countries, but within developing countries as well.
So I guess the takeaway there is this is not some shadowy network that is unattached and unaffiliated with sort of the mainstream financial institutions we know every day. But talk a little bit about just the scale of what this kind of activity in terms of tax avoidance and or just the cost of the economies, particularly in the developing world.
Right. Well, if we take a look at the estimates for how much money is actually parked in these offshore accounts, they are upwards of 30 trillion US dollars. So this is almost twice the GDP of the United States. The sums are just absolutely overwhelming. So to see this kind of transfer of capital occurring, oftentimes, again, from poor countries to New York and to London or Zurich is just absolutely an outrage. Now, on one level, of course, this is costing the treasuries of the UK and the United States. But on another level, it represents significant flows of capital coming in. So it's kind of balanced off a little bit with that. But if we think about the African continent, for instance, which is blessed with lots of natural resources, or as some would say, a natural resource curse, huge amounts of money are flowing out, and they are, as governments, not able to capture the revenue from these publicly owned, oftentimes, resources and use them for the development of their countries. Now, if we're looking at the former Soviet Union, that's another example where for the past 25 years, as dysfunctional as the Soviet Union was in many respects, its collapse kind of represented metaphorically, the felling of a huge sequoia. And once it was on the ground and down, these mushrooms started to kind of sprout off of this huge, massive dead tree, creating some new economic life, but from the literal death of the economy. And that was then harvested by these banks in New York and in London. So it's been a very big hit. And just to try and think of ways in which we can calculate the amounts of money which are being lost. I mean, if the United States is losing, let's say, $100 billion a year to its treasury from tax evasion and avoidance from its own citizens, Bernie Sanders' plan for providing free college tuition at public institutions, which many commentators have said is pie in the sky. It's something which you could never afford. I mean, that would only cost us about $75 billion a year. So the sums of money are quite large. They're not negligible. They could pay for a lot of good.
Well, David Cameron has gotten some unwelcome attention in all of this, but if you take a few years back, in June of 2013 at the G8 summit, he said we need to, quote, fight the scourge of tax evasion and aggressive tax avoidance with transparency, in particular about who owns which companies. So talk a little bit about his situation. What makes this statement ironic?
Well, sure. I mean, it's kind of interesting because, of course, his family had a trust, and so he was partaking in this. But it's not only Cameron. It's the former French leading figure as well in their government, Sarkozy, and it's also Vladimir Putin, and it's several others who have said for some time that this kind of activity needs to be reined in. And so increasingly what we're finding is that some lip service seems to be paid to this. Governments recognize that their balance sheets in part are being wrecked by this, but it's a bit of a prisoner's dilemma, I guess, in some sense. When everyone is doing it, you appear to be the fool for not engaging in it yourself. So it seems to be very, very difficult to stop. I think it would take some global cooperation. And if I can say, this isn't the first time we've seen this movie. We saw this really in the 1930s. And after World War II, a decision was rendered by the United Kingdom and the United States to roll back this activity because of the threat that it posed. And I could, detail that in some length, but in terms of what that threat was and how it unfolded. But it really took a kind of global cooperation to rein in this activity. And they did do it for about 30 years. Not completely, but they limited it significantly, and the global economy really prospered. So in the exact opposite environment that we currently have of low levels of taxation on the rich and this capital mobility and use of these offshore vehicles, in a completely different environment of very high levels of taxation, very aggressive progressive taxation, which is something that the United States, by the way, introduced during World War I, combined with high levels of control on the movement of capital, the global economy was much stronger. More money actually went into the real economy in terms of investment instead of all this speculative nonsense.
Well, let's talk a little bit about sort of what the people on the corporate side might say about all of this. But first, we'll take a short break. We'll be right back.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back. We're talking with Jeffrey Summers about the Panama Papers and related structures around the world. Well, if I'm the beneficiary of all of this, or perhaps an implementer of it, what I might say is I have a fiduciary responsibility to my shareholders, and what's wrong with making sure that profits are maximized by not paying more tax than I have to?
Well, I would say you're absolutely right. And so this is why it's incumbent upon governments to put in the rules and regulations, the laws, that prevent this kind of activity from taking place. You can't just depend upon companies and their representatives to individually act to limit this kind of activity, especially when their competitors are not. It just makes absolutely no sense. And you're right, they do have this responsibility to their shareholders. They do have to do this if the channels are open to them. At one time, again, in the late 1940s, mid to late 1940s, when the world was destroyed, when we had had 2 world wars and a Great Depression, the United States and the United Kingdom decided that the banks really needed to be controlled in this regard. Now, at that time, I should say, they actually did not legislate too many restrictions on banks in New York and London in terms of receiving capital from abroad. But what they did do is they really read them the Riot Act, and they said that if they didn't significantly curtail this activity, they were going to nationalize them. And the threat was real. And we had a massive recession in 1947, which made the very threat of a third depression, and perhaps leading to war again, something to be very much concerned about. And, our government leaders more or less got religion on this issue, and this practice was curbed. And so something similar is going to happen again. I mean, we're going to have to make a real firm stand on this issue. And I suspect that we're going to see many political leaders who are going to make noise about this, but who really, on a substantive level, aren't going to really do much to control it, unfortunately.
Well, talk a little bit about just the sort of populist, moral, if you will, aspect of this. I think there's a recent op-ed in the Guardian, and I'll read a piece of here. The Panama Papers confirmed that the super rich have effectively exited the economic system the rest of us have to live in. 30 years of runaway income for those at the top and the full armory of expensive financial sophistication mean they no longer play by the same rules the rest of us have to follow.
Yeah, well, there's a moral calculus, of course, at work here. I don't want to focus on that too much, but there have been psychological studies that have been done of the super rich. And what they indicate is not very pleasant, and that is that people who have far too much money seem to lose empathy for others, and they seem to act in very kind of aggressive and socially destructive ways. Now, I don't want to rejoin the class war which the rich have launched, in effect, on the rest of us, as Warren Buffett once noted in his now famous statement that there is indeed a class war, and my class is winning. But we need to think about the destructive impacts on our economy as a whole. Again, I think this is leading to lower levels of economic growth, lack of investment. And so, in the 1970s, we had an economic crisis. And the reasons for it were manyfold. Labor costs did actually grow significantly. They were growing in tandem from the end of World War II all the way up to the 1970s with productivity growth and with economic growth. And that was sustainable, and that was good. And so, in fact, workers' wages were increasing at roughly the same rate as the now famous 1%. But that calculus was changed by a few factors, one being the oil crisis, which really imposed a significant shock on the system, but also a generation out from World War II. People kind of forgot about some of the unpleasant things that had happened in the first half of the 20th century, and they started to think about ways of capturing more of the wealth that the economy could produce. Now, the long and the short of all of that is that in the 1970s, we had a lot of debates regarding what was needed to restore vigor and dynamism to the global economy. And what was said was that we needed this kind of new supply side model which would deliver increased levels of investment. So what was recognized was that the 90% or even the 99%, they don't invest much money. They more or less consume whatever it is that they're paid. But the 1% and those above them, they actually invest a lot of their money. And so if you throw more money at that 1%, they're going to invest it in productive enterprises. The economy is going to grow larger, and it would restore a kind of equilibrium, which would in effect make everyone very, very happy. But what has happened instead, and we've seen this now over the past 40 years, is that did not indeed happen. The money that was supposed to have eventually trickled down did not do so, and instead we had a veritable Niagara Falls of cash flow upward. But instead of that cash being invested in the real economy, oftentimes what happened is it was put into stock buybacks. So asset prices were radically inflated. There was asset inflation, of course, in the property markets as well. So, we saw a lot of kind of fictitious wealth being created through this inflation of asset prices. And the real economy has been more or less starved. So the very logic that was presented for why we would undertake this rather significant redistribution of income upward did not deliver the results that its architects, many of them economists, said that it would. So I think it's been more than enough time to reassess this model.
So if we look at the kinds of services that these offshore networks provide, we've used the two terms, tax evasion and tax avoidance a lot. What is that distinction? I mean, how much of this activity is truly nefarious in some way and illegal, and how much is just smart business?
Yeah, well, I think it's all nefarious, but a lot of it is legal. A lot of it's perfectly legal. And so, for instance, one of the things that you might choose to do, if you're, it gives really large, significant advantages to larger companies. So a lot of our small to medium-sized enterprises are where a lot of innovation takes place, but unfortunately, they are not receiving the same benefits that these larger companies can. I'm sorry, but just to explain very quickly. So, for instance, what these larger companies can do is, let's say they have multinational operations. What they can do is they can set up a offshore company in a country like Panama, for instance, and they can move profits and accounts through there, and declare that a lot of their business is taking place in that particular country, and shop around for a much lower tax rate. So, for instance, we just saw this locally with Johnson Controls. There was a bit of a media kerfuffle, of course, regarding
inversion.
Exactly, and they're setting up operations, of course, in Ireland to take advantage of their lower tax rates. Now, you can also do things with invoicing as well, as you're transferring equipment and other goods back and forth between various operations. I mean, you can really have your accountants go to work on that and make it appear as though most of your economic activity is occurring in the lowest tax rate country in which you're incorporated, even though it's not. So we see a massive loss of tax revenue from this. Now, again, I actually don't blame the companies that are involved in this unless they're actually lobbying for its continuance. But for those who are taking advantage of the laws that are just there, they really have to, because they're competing with other companies that are doing the same thing. But from an economics perspective, it is so wasteful. Again, it's a massive misallocation of resources. So you're paying these veritable armies of accountants and lawyers, which have nice tall steel and glass buildings that have to be built and paid for to do all of this kind of work, when in effect it would be better just to destroy all of that stuff and put them to work on real wealth creation. Whether that's engineering, research and design, and any number of other areas. So we're wasting all of this human talent and materials as well to support this massive infrastructure, and it is massive.
So what kinds of policy responses might there be if we were to get to the point that you're proposing here?
Sure. Well, I think it would really take some global cooperation. Now, before we go there, the United States, I think, could be far more aggressive in terms of trying to control some of this activity. It could, for instance, state that money that is currently being held abroad, that they would not be able to repatriate it after a certain point of time unless it's brought home. Although no significant incentive should be given to do that. George Bush already tried that once, and money came home in torrents. It was taxed at only 5%, and then that money was just used for stock buybacks and other things to create more of the kind of asset inflation that I was talking about. So in other words, the United States government really saw very little benefit from that.
So we've got a minute to solve the problem.
Yeah. So that can be done at the domestic level. But in terms of really getting at this problem, we really need to have full access to banking records. And we need to stop states, for instance, such as Delaware, who incorporate all of these offshore companies that permit a lot of these tax avoidance and even evasion schemes to occur. But the resistance is going to be massive. I mean, again, cities like London are absolutely dependent on this sector. I mean, that's what supports them. And what would the UK do, well, without London and its economy? So disentangling this is going to be very difficult because there will be losers.
Well, we're going to have to leave it at that. Jeff Summers, thank you for being with us once again.
Always good to see you, Doug.
To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,